You didn't wake up motivated. You woke up tired of your own patterns, tired of hearing the same promises echo in your head every night and watching them collapse every morning. Tired of telling yourself, this is the last time, while knowing, deep down, that it wasn't. Because you had built a life that rewarded comfort and punished discipline. And the worst part is, you knew it. You felt it in the quiet moments when the noise faded and you were left alone with your thoughts, that heavy, suffocating awareness that you were capable of more, but choosing less. That you were designed for something sharper, stronger, more focused. Yet you kept feeding the weakest version of yourself. And that contradiction started to eat you alive, slowly, silently, like rust spreading beneath polished metal, invisible to everyone else but impossible for you to ignore. And every distraction you reached for wasn't relief, it was delay. Every scroll, every empty conversation, every moment you chose easy over necessary was another brick in the wall you were building between you and the life you claimed you wanted. And eventually, that wall got so thick that even you started to believe it was permanent. That this version of you, the distracted, inconsistent, undisciplined version, was who you were, not just who you had become. And that's where most people stop. That's where they surrender. They label it personality. They call it reality. They say, this is just how I am. But you felt something different, something uncomfortable, a resistance to that idea. A quiet but persistent voice that refused to accept that this was your final form. And that voice didn't scream. It didn't hype you up. It didn't give you motivation. It just told you the truth, cold and direct. You are the problem. Not your circumstances, not your past, not your environment. You, your choices, your habits, your tolerance for mediocrity. And that truth hit harder than any failure ever could, because failure can be blamed, but responsibility can't. And once you saw it, really saw it, there was no going back to ignorance, no hiding behind excuses that you knew were hollow. And suddenly, all the things you used to justify your behavior started to feel weak, embarrassing even, like lies you were telling a version of yourself that no longer existed. And that's when the discomfort shifted from external to internal. It wasn't about what was happening around you anymore. It was about what you were allowing within you, the standards you were lowering, the discipline you were avoiding, the potential you were wasting. And it became unbearable, not in a dramatic, explosive way, but in a quiet, relentless pressure that followed you everywhere, in every decision, every moment of hesitation, every time you reached for comfort instead of growth. And you started to notice patterns, the triggers, the automatic behaviors, the way your mind negotiated with you, offering small compromises that always led to bigger failures. Just 5 more minutes, just 1 more video, just today, you'll start tomorrow. And you realized those weren't random thoughts, they were strategies. Your mind protecting its addiction to ease, to familiarity, to safety. And you had been obeying them without question for years. And that realization was brutal, because it meant you weren't in control, not really. You were being controlled by impulses dressed up as choices, and that's when something inside you snapped. Not emotionally, not impulsively, but logically, decisively. You saw the pattern and understood that if nothing changed, nothing would change. That motivation wasn't coming. That clarity wasn't going to magically appear. That no external force was going to step in and fix what you were unwilling to confront. And in that moment, you made a decision that didn't feel exciting. It didn't feel powerful. It felt necessary, like cutting off a limb to save your life. You decided to disappear, not physically, not in a dramatic attention-seeking way, but strategically, intentionally. You chose to remove yourself from the noise, from the constant input that kept you distracted and reactive. You chose to step out of the environment that fed your worst habits and into one that would force you to face them. And that decision was quiet, almost invisible. There was no announcement, no declaration, no "this is day one" post. Because you understood something most people don't. That real change doesn't need an audience. In fact, it's often destroyed by one. Because the moment you seek validation for the process, you dilute the purpose of it. You start performing instead of transforming. And you weren't interested in performing anymore. You were done pretending, done signaling, done collecting empty praise for intentions that never turned into actions. You wanted results. Real, tangible, undeniable results. And you knew those could only be built in silence, in isolation, in the absence of distraction and approval. So you started cutting things off, one by one, not randomly, but deliberately. You removed the apps that consumed your time, the notifications that hijacked your attention, the habits that filled your day without moving you forward. And it felt uncomfortable, almost unnatural, like you were stripping away parts of your identity. Because in a way, you were. Those habits weren't just behaviors. They were coping mechanisms. They were how you avoided thinking, how you escaped responsibility, how you numbed the awareness of your own stagnation. And without them, you were exposed, raw, unfiltered, left alone with your thoughts in a way you hadn't been in a long time. And that silence wasn't peaceful at first. It was loud, chaotic, filled with everything you had been avoiding: doubts, regrets, unfinished goals, broken promises. And it would have been easy to run back to the noise, to reinstall the distractions, to tell yourself you'll try again later. But you didn't, because you understood that this discomfort wasn't a sign that something was wrong. It was a sign that something was finally right, that you were no longer numbing the problem. You were facing it, and facing it meant feeling it, all of it, without escape, without shortcuts, without relief. And that's where the real process began, not with action, not with productivity, but with awareness, with seeing yourself clearly, without the filters, without the excuses, and accepting that before you could build anything new, you had to confront what was already there. And that required a level of honesty that most people avoid their entire lives, because it's easier to stay distracted than to admit you've been wasting your potential. It's easier to blame circumstances than to take ownership of your habits. But you chose the harder path, not because you felt strong, but because you were tired of being weak, tired of the gap between who you were and who you knew you could be. And that gap became your focus, your obsession, not in an emotional, impulsive way, but in a calculated, disciplined way. You started observing your behavior like an outsider, noticing the patterns without judgment but with precision, identifying where you lost control, where you hesitated, where you defaulted to comfort. And instead of reacting, you paused. You created space between impulse and action. And in that space, you found something you hadn't felt in a long time: choice, real choice, not the illusion of it, not the automatic responses you had been calling decisions, but actual control over what you did next. And it was small at first, almost insignificant, choosing not to check your phone, choosing to sit in silence a little longer, choosing to follow through on a simple task instead of abandoning it halfway. But those small choices started to stack, and with each one, you felt a shift, subtle but undeniable, like you were reclaiming parts of yourself that had been buried under years of distraction. And that's when the idea of 90 days took form, not as a challenge, not as a trend, but as a commitment, a container, a defined period where you would remove everything non-essential and focus entirely on rebuilding from the ground up. And you didn't romanticize it. You didn't expect it to be easy or enjoyable. You saw it for what it was: a confrontation, a reset, a controlled environment where you could dismantle the habits that were holding you back and replace them with ones that would move you forward. And you knew it would require sacrifice, not just of time, but of comfort, of convenience, of the small pleasures that had become your default. And you accepted that, because you finally understood that you can't keep the same lifestyle and expect a different outcome, that change demands trade-offs, and if you're not willing to give something up, you're not serious about gaining anything meaningful. And that clarity gave you direction. It simplified everything. No more overthinking, no more searching for the perfect plan, just a clear objective. Remove what weakens you, build what strengthens you, and repeat every day, without exception, without negotiation. And as you stepped into that decision, into that silence, into that intentional isolation, you felt something you hadn't felt in a long time. Not excitement, not motivation, but alignment. A sense that for the first time in a long time, your actions were starting to match your awareness, that you were no longer lying to yourself about what needed to be done. And that alignment didn't make things easier, but it made them clearer. And clarity is far more powerful than motivation, because motivation fades, but clarity remains. It anchors you when things get hard. It reminds you why you started when your mind starts looking for exits. And you knew there would be moments like that, moments where the discomfort would peak, where the urge to return to your old habits would feel overwhelming. But you also knew that those moments were the test, not the obstacle, that passing them was the point, not avoiding them. And with that understanding, you didn't just disappear from the world, you disappeared from the version of yourself that had been holding you back. And that was the real beginning, not the first day, not the first action, but the moment you decided that you were no longer willing to tolerate your own excuses, that you were ready to face yourself fully, without distraction, without denial, and start rebuilding, one decision at a time. The first thing you notice when the noise disappears is not peace, it's resistance, sharp and immediate. Like your mind has been cornered and is now fighting back with everything it has. Because for the first time in a long time, you are no longer feeding it the constant stream of stimulation it has grown addicted to. And without that supply, it starts to panic, it starts to push, it starts to whisper with a voice that sounds exactly like you, but carries none of your intention, telling you this is unnecessary, telling you this is too extreme, telling you can still improve without going this far. And that voice is calm, reasonable, almost logical, but underneath it there is something fragile, something desperate, because it knows if you continue down this path, it will lose control. And that is what withdrawal really is. Not just the absence of distraction, but the exposure of dependence. The realization that what you thought was harmless entertainment, harmless comfort, harmless routine, was actually a system of control that dictated your attention, your energy, your decisions. And now that system is being dismantled piece by piece, and your mind doesn't like it. It craves the quick hit, the easy escape, the familiar pattern. And when it doesn't get it, it escalates. It becomes louder, more persistent, more creative, offering you justifications dressed up as rewards. You've done enough for today. You deserve a break. This isn't sustainable. And each one of those thoughts feels valid in the moment because they are designed to protect your current identity, the version of you that avoids discomfort and seeks relief. And if you're not careful, if you don't recognize what's happening, you will follow them automatically, like you always have. You will slip back into the same patterns and call it balance, call it moderation, call it being realistic. But you know the truth. You've tried that before. You've negotiated with your habits before. And every time you did, you lost. Slowly, quietly, but consistently. And that's why this time is different. Because this time, you are not negotiating. You are observing. You are separating yourself from the impulse instead of merging with it. And that separation is uncomfortable. It creates tension, because now there is a gap between what you feel like doing and what you choose to do. And in that gap, there is friction, real friction, the kind that forces you to confront your own lack of control, the kind that makes you realize how often you act without thinking, how often you give in without resistance. And sitting in that friction is not easy. It feels unnatural, like you are going against your own wiring, because in a way, you are. You are breaking patterns that have been reinforced for years, and those patterns don't disappear quietly. They fight, they push, they look for any opening to reestablish themselves. And in the first few days, they almost succeed. You catch yourself reaching for your phone without thinking, opening apps you already decided to remove, searching for stimulation out of pure habit, not intention. And every time it happens, there is a moment of awareness, a split second where you realize what you're doing, and in that moment, you have a choice: continue the pattern or interrupt it. And at first, you don't always win. Sometimes the habit is too strong, too automatic, and you fall into it, even if only for a few seconds. But the difference now is that you see it, clearly, without denial. And that awareness changes everything, because you can't unsee it. You can't go back to pretending it's not happening. And slowly, those moments of awareness become more frequent, more immediate, until they start to come before the action instead of after it. And that's when you begin to regain control. Not completely, not perfectly, but enough to create resistance, enough to pause, enough to choose differently. And those small interruptions are the foundation of discipline. Not big dramatic changes, but tiny decisions repeated consistently, each one reinforcing the idea that you are not a slave to your impulses, that you can feel the urge and still choose not to act on it. And that realization is powerful, but it doesn't make things easier. In fact, it often makes them harder, because now you are fully aware of the battle. You can't escape into mindless behavior anymore. You are present in every moment of discomfort, every urge, every craving, and that presence amplifies the intensity. It forces you to experience the withdrawal fully, without numbing it, without distracting yourself from it. And that's where most people break, not because the process is impossible, but because it's uncomfortable in a way they are not used to. A sustained, low-level discomfort that doesn't spike and disappear, but lingers, follows you, sits with you, and tests your patience, your focus, your commitment. And in those moments, your mind becomes a master of negotiation. It doesn't ask you to quit completely. It just asks for small compromises, small deviations from the plan. Just this once, just for a few minutes. And if you give in, even slightly, it gains ground. It reinforces the old pattern. It reminds your brain that the escape is still available. And that makes the next urge stronger, not weaker. And you start to see the pattern clearly, how every small decision compounds, how every moment of weakness is not isolated but connected, part of a larger system that either builds you or breaks you. And that awareness sharpens your focus. It makes you more intentional, more deliberate, because now you understand that this is not about one decision. It's about identity. It's about who you are becoming with every action you take. And that shifts your perspective. It moves you from reacting to responding, from chasing comfort to building control. And you start to structure your days differently, not out of inspiration, but out of necessity. You remove ambiguity. You reduce the number of decisions you have to make, because you realize that every unnecessary choice is an opportunity for your old habits to slip back in. So you simplify. You create routines. You decide in advance what your day will look like, what you will do, when you will do it. And you follow that structure even when you don't feel like it, especially when you don't feel like it. Because you are no longer relying on emotion to guide your actions. You are relying on commitment. And that shift is critical, because emotions are unstable. They fluctuate. They change based on external factors. But commitment is stable. It's a decision that doesn't depend on how you feel in the moment. And as you reinforce that commitment day after day, you start to notice a change. Not dramatic, not immediate, but subtle and consistent. The urges don't disappear, but they lose some of their power. They become easier to observe without acting on them, easier to let pass without engaging, and your tolerance for discomfort increases. What felt unbearable in the beginning now feels manageable. What felt like a constant battle now feels like a controlled resistance. And that's the adaptation process. Your mind recalibrating to a new baseline. One where stimulation is not constant, where effort is required, where discipline is the default instead of the exception. And that recalibration takes time. It doesn't happen in a few days. It doesn't follow a linear path. There are moments where it feels like you're making progress, and then moments where it feels like you're back at the beginning, where the urges come back stronger, where your focus drops, where your energy dips. And in those moments, the temptation to quit is real, because it feels like all the effort isn't working, like the change isn't happening. But that's part of the process. The resistance before adaptation. The phase where your old patterns are making a final push before they weaken. And if you understand that, if you expect it, you don't panic when it happens. You don't interpret it as failure. You see it for what it is, a test, a necessary part of the transition. And you stay consistent. You keep showing up. You keep executing the plan even when it feels ineffective, because you trust the process more than your temporary emotions. And that trust is built through repetition, through evidence, through the accumulation of small wins that prove to you that you can do this, that you can endure discomfort, that you can follow through on your commitments. And with each day that you do, your confidence shifts. Not the loud, external kind, but a quiet, internal certainty that you are becoming more in control, more disciplined, more aligned with the version of yourself you set out to build. And that certainty becomes your anchor, the thing you rely on when the motivation is gone, when the excitement fades, when all that's left is the work. Because at the end of the day, that's what this phase is about. Not feeling good, not looking good, not proving anything to anyone else, but building the capacity to do what needs to be done regardless of how you feel. And that capacity is what separates those who change temporarily from those who change permanently. Because once you develop it, once you internalize it, you are no longer dependent on external factors to move forward. You have built something internal, something stable, something that allows you to operate even in the absence of motivation. And that is the real breakthrough of withdrawal. Not the removal of distraction, but the discovery of control, the realization that you can sit in discomfort, in silence, in resistance, and still choose to act in alignment with your goals. And once you experience that, even in small doses, you understand that the power was never in the distractions you removed. It was in the discipline you built in their absence. And that discipline becomes the foundation for everything that comes next. You stopped relying on willpower the moment you realized it was unreliable, inconsistent, emotional, and you replaced it with something far more dangerous, a system, cold, structured, non-negotiable, something that didn't care how you felt when you woke up, didn't care if you were tired, distracted, or unmotivated, because the entire point of a system is to remove the need to decide, and decision is where you used to lose. Every single time, you would stand at the edge of action and hesitate, overthink, negotiate, delay, and by the time you made a choice, the moment was gone, replaced by comfort, replaced by avoidance, replaced by the same pattern you claimed you wanted to break. So you cut that out completely. You removed the question, "What should I do today?" and replaced it with, "This is what gets done." No alternatives, no backup plan, no emotional input, just execution. And that shift alone changed everything, because now your days were no longer open-ended. They were defined, pre-decided, structured with intention. Every hour had a purpose. Every block of time was assigned. And that structure became your shield against chaos. Because chaos thrives in undefined space, in moments where you don't know what to do next, where your mind starts searching for the easiest option, the fastest reward, the path of least resistance. And now there was no space for that. You woke up, and the first move was already decided. No phone, no noise, no external input, just silence and action. You got up not because you felt ready, but because the system said so, and that was the rule. You follow the system, not your feelings. And in those early mornings, when your body was still heavy, when your mind tried to pull you back into comfort, you didn't argue with it. You didn't motivate yourself. You moved, immediately, decisively, because hesitation is the doorway to weakness, and you had closed that door. You eliminated the gap between thought and action, and that speed, that decisiveness, became a weapon, because the faster you act, the less time your mind has to interfere. And once you were up, the next steps were already lined up. Physical training, not optional, not flexible, but fixed, a non-negotiable anchor in your day, something that grounded you, that forced you to confront resistance immediately, because your body doesn't lie. It reflects your discipline in real time. And every rep, every set, every moment you pushed through discomfort reinforced the identity you were building, not through words, but through action, through proof. And that's what you were after. Proof that you could do hard things consistently, not once, not when it felt good, but every day, regardless of mood, regardless of circumstances. And after training, you didn't drift, you transitioned, directly into focused work. Deep, uninterrupted, no distractions, no multitasking, just one task at a time executed with full attention. Because you understood that focus is not something you have, it's something you train. And like any muscle, it grows through resistance, through sustained effort, through pushing past the urge to switch, to check, to escape. And at first, it was difficult. Your mind would wander. It would look for stimulation. It would try to pull you away from the task. But the system didn't allow that. You stayed. You brought your attention back, again and again, as many times as it took. Because that's the training, not staying focused effortlessly, but returning to focus deliberately, repeatedly. And over time, that ability strengthened. Your sessions became longer, deeper, more productive. And you started to notice something. You were getting more done in less time. Not because you were working harder, but because you were working cleaner, without interruption, without wasted energy. And that efficiency gave you momentum. And momentum is powerful because it reduces friction. It makes the next action easier, the next session smoother, the next day more predictable. And your system was designed to build that momentum, to stack wins early, to create a rhythm that carried you through the day. And you protected that rhythm aggressively. You didn't allow random inputs to disrupt it. You didn't check messages in the middle of deep work. You didn't allow yourself to drift into low-value activities, because you understood that every interruption has a cost, not just in time, but in focus, in energy, in mental clarity. And those costs add up, they compound. They slow you down in ways you don't notice immediately, but feel over time. so you eliminated them as much as possible. You created an environment that supported your system, minimal, clean, free of unnecessary triggers, because environment shapes behavior, whether you admit it or not. And instead of relying on discipline alone, you made discipline easier by removing obstacles, by reducing temptation, by aligning your surroundings with your goals. And that alignment made consistency sustainable, because now you weren't fighting your environment, you were working with it. And as the days passed, your system evolved, not randomly, but through feedback. You tracked what worked, what didn't, where you lost time, where you lost focus, and you adjusted, refined, optimized. Because a system is not static, it's dynamic. It adapts to you as you adapt to it. And that process of refinement made you more aware, more intentional, more precise in how you used your time and energy. You stopped doing things just because you always had. You questioned everything, every habit, every task, every commitment, asking one simple question: does this move me forward or hold me back? And if it didn't move you forward, it was removed. No hesitation, no attachment, because you were no longer operating from comfort, you were operating from purpose. And purpose requires sacrifice. It requires letting go of things that feel good but lead nowhere. And that's not easy. But it becomes easier when you see the results, when you feel the difference, when you experience the clarity that comes from living with intention instead of reaction. And your system reinforced that clarity daily. It gave you a framework to operate within, a set of rules that simplified your decisions, reduced your mental load, and allowed you to focus on execution. And that's where most people fail, not because they lack ambition, but because they lack structure. They rely on motivation, on mood, on external factors, and when those fluctuate, their actions fluctuate with them. But your system removed that variability. It created consistency, and consistency is what drives results. Not intensity, not bursts of effort, but steady, repeated action over time. And you committed to that, fully. You didn't look for shortcuts. You didn't chase quick wins. You trusted the process, even when the results were not immediately visible, even when progress felt slow, because you understood that real change is not always obvious in the moment. It accumulates beneath the surface, like pressure building, like a foundation being laid. And one day, it becomes visible, undeniable, but only if you stay consistent long enough. And that's what your system ensured. It kept you moving forward, even when you couldn't see the outcome. It kept you grounded in action instead of expectation. And that removed a lot of frustration, a lot of doubt, because you were no longer focused on immediate results. You were focused on daily execution, on meeting the standard you set for yourself. And that standard became your benchmark. Not comparison to others, not external validation, but your own defined level of performance. And every day you either met it or you didn't. No excuses, no stories, just a clear assessment. And that honesty kept you accountable. It prevented you from slipping into complacency, from lowering the bar when things got hard. And when you did fall short, because it happens, you didn't dwell on it. You didn't overanalyze. You corrected and moved on. Because the system doesn't care about perfection. It cares about consistency, about returning to the standard as quickly as possible. And that resilience, that ability to recover without losing momentum, is what made your system sustainable. It allowed you to navigate setbacks without collapsing, to adjust without quitting. And over time, that built confidence. Not the kind that comes from success, but the kind that comes from reliability, from knowing that you will show up, that you will execute, that you will follow through regardless of circumstances. And that reliability is what makes you dangerous, because now your actions are predictable, not to others, but to yourself. You know what you will do, you know how you will respond, and that certainty eliminates hesitation. It removes doubt. It creates a direct path from intention to action, and that's where real power lies. Not in doing more, but in doing what matters consistently, without deviation, without compromise. And your system became the vehicle for that, the structure that carried you through the days when motivation was gone, the discipline that replaced emotion, the framework that turned potential into reality, one executed task at a time. Somewhere in the middle of the process, without warning, without a dramatic moment, something inside you began to shift. Not loudly, not in a way the world could see, but in a way you could feel every time you made a decision, every time you responded to discomfort, every time you followed through instead of backing down. Because identity does not change in a single breakthrough. It reshapes itself quietly through repetition, through proof, through the accumulation of actions that either confirm who you think you are or destroy it completely. And up until this point, your identity had been built on inconsistency, on starting and stopping, on promising and breaking, on wanting more but settling for less. And whether you admitted it or not, that history had weight. It influenced how you saw yourself, how much you trusted yourself, how seriously you took your own goals. Because every time you failed to follow through, you weren't just missing a task, you were reinforcing a belief. I don't do what I say. And that belief became your ceiling, an invisible limit that shaped your behavior, that kept you operating below your potential. Because deep down, you didn't fully believe you could sustain change. You didn't fully trust that this time would be different. And that lack of trust created hesitation, doubt, subtle resistance that showed up when things got hard, when discipline was required. But now, after weeks of consistent execution, something started to crack. Not your discipline, but that old belief, because you were stacking evidence against it, day after day, showing up, executing, following through, even when it was inconvenient, even when it was uncomfortable. And each time you did, you sent a different message to yourself, not through words, but through action. I am someone who follows through. And at first that message felt foreign, almost like a lie, because it contradicted your past. But you didn't argue with it. You reinforced it, again and again, until it started to feel less like a statement and more like a fact. And that's how identity shifts. Not through affirmations, not through thinking differently, but through acting differently long enough that your mind has no choice but to update its model of who you are. And as that update began, you noticed changes in how you approached your day. Tasks that used to feel heavy now felt neutral. Not easy, but not overwhelming either. Because you weren't carrying the same internal resistance. You weren't questioning whether you would do them. You already knew the answer. And that certainty removed friction. It allowed you to move faster, cleaner, more directly from intention to action. And your internal dialogue changed as well. The voice that used to negotiate, to offer excuses, to look for exits, was still there, but it had less influence, less authority, because it had been ignored so many times that it no longer felt like a command, just background noise. And in its place there was something else, something quieter but stronger, a sense of direction, a clear standard that you held yourself to, not because you felt like it, but because it was now part of who you were. And that standard didn't fluctuate with your mood. It didn't lower itself when you were tired or stressed. It remained constant. And that consistency created stability, a foundation you could rely on regardless of external conditions. And that stability is what allowed you to lead yourself instead of being led by impulse. Because that's what this phase really is, leadership, not over others, but over yourself. The ability to direct your actions intentionally, to override immediate desires in favor of long-term outcomes, to choose what is necessary over what is comfortable. And that ability is built through practice, through repeated moments where you could have chosen the easy path but didn't. And each of those moments strengthened your control, your discipline, your identity. And as this new identity took shape, you began to see your past differently, not as something to be ashamed of, but as something that explained where you were, something that provided contrast, that made the change more visible, more meaningful, because you could feel the difference, not just in what you were doing, but in how you were thinking, how you were responding, how you were carrying yourself. There was less hesitation, less second-guessing, less internal conflict, because your actions were aligned with your intentions. And alignment creates confidence, not the loud, performative kind, but a quiet certainty, a trust in yourself that comes from evidence, from knowing that when you say you will do something, you do it. And that trust is powerful because it removes one of the biggest obstacles to growth, doubt. When you trust yourself, you don't waste energy questioning your ability to follow through. You focus on execution, and that focus accelerates everything. It allows you to take on more, to push further, to expand your capacity without being held back by uncertainty. And that expansion is noticeable, not necessarily to others,